Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight on my revolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers, here's the Associate Professor at the School of Communication Studies at AUT, Media Oracle, Dr. Wayne Hope. And here's a former Green Party MP, well-known activist and social justice druid, Keith Locke. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, Ports of Auckland strike action continues. Do the Ports of Auckland actually want to settle, or do they just want to break the unions? Issue 2, John Key's electorate chairman now wants to be New Zealand on Air chairman while censoring political documentaries that embarrass John Key. How very North Korean of us. Issue 3, Occupation Auckland gets shut down. Is the occupation movement over? And we'll end the show on the final word, but let's kick things off with issue 1. The Ports of Auckland disputes continue with very little to suggest that they want to budge on cutting $20,000 from each pay packet. Such a stance over such a manufactured crisis demands answers for the true intent here. Wayne, I put to you that the Ports of Auckland don't want a solution to this crisis, and that they actually simply want to kill off the union. Is that a fair analysis?
Oh, absolutely, from day one. If you go back to early January, and of course the dispute's been simmering long before that, but early January there was what I would call a hit, a statement saying you've got to casualise, here is our position, take it or leave it. When did that happen? First week of January, in the middle of the silly season.
That's right.
Campbell show's not on. Parliament hasn't reformed yet. In other words, getting some real momentum going to put the workers and the union leaders on the back foot and to go for it. So no question about that. And if you fast forward to what's happening now, the Ports of Auckland employers, as we speak, hiring consultants to look how they can casualise the workforce. This is not about pay. This is about job security.
Keith, the Productivity Commission report notes that it isn't labour practices that make our exports uncompetitive. They point out that it's shipping costs. Freight from Sydney to Singapore is $500, whereas freight from Auckland to Singapore is $1,500. Aren't Ports of Auckland focusing on the molehill rather than the mountain if this is truly about competition?
Yeah, well, a few months ago, Ports of Auckland had this celebration of increased throughput of containers. It's not about productivity at all, and the union is clearly willing to work for improvements and new systems and all the rest of it. The key issue is the casualisation to stop full-time employment, 40 hours work, 40 hours pay, go to a casual workforce and get rid of the union. Why else would they want to just sack all the workers and hire a whole new bunch of contractors if they didn't want to smash the union? And that's where the whole union movement and the public in New Zealand should get worried. And it's very dangerous work too. There's been 3 deaths at Tauranga Port,
That's right.
and that's a port where the union's been largely shut out.
That's correct.
You know, I've been an overhead crane driver myself in railway workshops in the Hutt Valley, and you know, you just make a little mistake and someone dies.
Sure.
So you can't just throw that open and have a casual workforce for
And
safety.
that was summed up very nicely in a Dominion Post feature on the dispute, and it had a photo of the protesters, the union protesters and so on, and had a young lad with a placard saying, "My daddy wants a roster." And that really sums it up. And that's why this issue is important for many, many New Zealanders. And that's also why I think that the unions have actually, the Maritime Union has actually engendered a little bit of sympathy on this in this regard. A lot of middle New Zealanders who might not necessarily be left-wing or anything like that, they would also like to have jobs where they don't have to ring up to see if they're on the roster every morning before they go to work. They've got rent to pay, electricity bills to pay, mortgages to service perhaps. So this particular issue has an enormous national resonance.
Is this the low wage economy that the government were promising only last year when they were selling it as a reason why people would want to invest here, because we have a low wage economy? Is this an example of that low wage economy?
Yeah, I think it is, and also by reducing the union presence, you can lower the wages even more, because there's not the organisation to improve wages. Already there's a level of casualisation. In fact, years ago when I was growing up, they called them seagulls, I think,
Yep.
overload sort of workforce. And half of the workforce already is casual, but you've got to have that permanent, skilled workforce, particularly to keep safety.
Isn't this going to be one of the ridiculous fallouts from this, is that we're going to end up paying out a whole bunch of salaries to people, workers who are leaving, who are then going to take their skills to Australia and get paid 3 times the amount of money.
Well, Bomber, this is Groundhog Day to me.
Right.
If you go back to 1990 when telecom was privatised,
Yep.
and many people were laid off, casualisation was brought in, subcontracting and all the rest of it. They cut the staff to the bone. I know at least of one case where a top skilled worker from SOE Telecom, privatised, he goes offshore, gets a job with British Telecom in Thailand. A similar thing's going to happen on the wharves.
Yeah.
You cut it to the bone. Now, what's going on here is not about productivity in terms of rate of how fast you're working and so on. There's 2 levels of productivity. There's a nastier level than the normal garden variety capitalist level, and that is being answerable to institutional shareholders. So that means your rate of profit over time.
Yep.
It basically means Port A and Port B having an arms race with each other, dog eat dog, right? And that means whole workforces can go down the drain. And certainly whole sets of conditions that have been built up over generations go down the drain as well.
Is Ports of Auckland trying this on now as the first salvo in the reality of John Key winning in November? This is corporate New Zealand saying, hey, let's see how far we can go now that John's back in power. Is that what we're saying?
I think so, and it's another step in the privatisation too. This contracting out is effectively privatisation, and they want the Ports of Auckland, which is council-owned, just to sort of own the land, and then all the work's done by these private companies. But I think we can win this one, talking for people who support the unions and workers' rights. With a big campaign, the union, CTU, and that's already behind it. Hopefully we can get all the progressive parties, Greens, Mana, Labour behind it, and the International Transport Federation, the ITF,
yes, this is important,
has already sent a letter, that's General Secretary, saying, look, you're in trouble if you move against the union, and they've got strong power.
That's right.
Any ship leaving Auckland, if it uses non-union labour, just doesn't arrive in another port.
So this can have ramifications.
There's a couple of issues there. I mean, generally I agree with Keith, but there's 2 problems with the optimistic scenario, and that is we haven't had anything really solid either coming from the Mayor of the Super City Auckland.
No, we haven't.
And
Glenn's been very quiet, hasn't he?
And we haven't had anything solid come from the new leader of the Labour Party.
Remarkable, isn't it?
2 dogs that haven't really barked.
No, that's right.
You use a Sherlock Holmes analogy.
Wayne,
now that's significant because if this gets down and dirty, then the failure of those figures to say things or act in the appropriate way won't help the union.
Has the spin job, Wayne, by Ports of Auckland been successful, and have the unions been behind the 8 ball? I don't think they've appreciated the ferocity with which Ports of Auckland were going to go gun after them, were they?
No, but there's a problem for the bosses here too, is that the ferocity and the planned nature of the agenda is pretty clear. But they're not necessarily winning the PR battle. They've had to backtrack on what the highest salary is on the port, presumably. And the other thing too is that when you're talking about issues like job security and rosters, it's pretty hard for them to argue that giving up your job security is somehow good for the economy or good for New Zealand. And so what I noticed in the first part of the dispute when it heated up again in the first half of January is that it looked like the bosses were winning the PR war. But since then, I think the union side's has had more space than it did before, both in the mainstream press, and certainly there's been a dog-eat-dog battle in the blogosphere.
In the blogosphere, there's been a lot of blood on the floor in the last couple of days.
I just hope some of the bloggers don't give out their physical addresses.
I know, it's getting pretty nasty out there. Keith, has Labour missed a political opportunity by keeping quiet, or are they attempting to break from Labour's union pass to win over national voters? What's the strategy here?
Well, there's a long history of Labour being in the centre, sort of neither one side nor the other, going back to the 51 waterfront lockout, actually. And that's why you have parties like the Greens and Mana who take a more stronger stand for social justice, workers' rights, etc., because Labour so far hasn't really addressed the issue of union bashing, and you know, that they're trying to get rid of
But the
union.
unions put a lot of money into Labour. Surely they would be sitting there going, "What is this for? Where's our protection? Why aren't you standing up for us?"
Yeah, well, there's two things going on. That you have groups like the Greens and Mana
That's
trying
right.
to pull the Labor into a better
Denise
position.
Roche has been much louder on this issue than
Yeah.
any Auckland or any Labour
Yeah,
party.
and the other thing that's happening gradually, of
Right.
course, is the unions are looking more to
That's right, that's
parties
right,
like the
that's
Greens.
right.
And
What's happened here is that the Ports of Auckland bosses have, in a sense, they've laid down a gauntlet here.
Yeah.
And it's incumbent upon people like the Mayor of Auckland and the leader of the Labour Party to pick that gauntlet up or not.
Yeah. Question to both of you finally on this. The Ports of Auckland have followed up their union-busting manufacturing crisis by demanding more space in the harbour. Why should Aucklanders support losing more public space to a company who is not behaving in a way that is beneficial for its workers? Why would Aucklanders want to have and open up more public space to the ports?
Well, interestingly, in today's New Zealand Herald, the paper was arguing that there should be more open debate over that.
Yeah.
And I agree with them entirely, just as there should be open debate about the conditions of work for those who work on
That's
board.
right, yeah.
The challenge in Auckland is to get more open space for people and have it in a nice, planned sort of way.
Yeah.
When as a former MP, I spent a lot of time in Wellington. I loved walking around the Wellington waterfront because it's been developed for the people. And
That's right.
Auckland's been a piecemeal development of the waterfront as public space. And instead, there seems to be the whole emphasis on more for the port, which is not really necessary.
Right. Thank you, panel. Moving on to issue 2. Fresh from controversy that John Key's electorate chairman complained to New Zealand On Air about the TV3 poverty documentary and has set in motion plans to censor any topic that embarrasses the government in an election period, Stephen McElroy is now reportedly interested in being the chairman for New Zealand On Air. Keith, is New Zealand On Air a functioning public broadcasting funder, or is it in danger of being seen as an extension of the National Party propaganda machine?
Yeah, I think you're right here, because there's a thing called the Broadcasting Standards Authority that's supposed to deal with issues of content.
Sure.
And the funding body shouldn't have a political appointee on the board, because you can see exactly where that leads, that they don't want to embarrass the government. Then even more disconcerting is you've got people like Neil Walter, who's the chair of the board, and even Jane Wrightson, saying, "Oh, we're getting nervous here."
That's right.
Discussing politics in an election is supposedly wrong. That's idiotic.
Wayne, we accept political appointments in our system in New Zealand.
Well, can I just stop you there? I don't think there should be any political appointments or people who belong to parties actually being on New Zealand.
Is this just too close?
It's not just about this government.
Yep.
You could have made the same criticisms of party appointments
That's right,
when
under Labour.
Helen Clark was the Prime Minister. So I believe that as a matter of principle, there's no one who's an existing member of a party should be on those positions, on those boards, right? So that's my statement of principle. If you want to get down to the dirty politics, your earlier point about this is the second term of a national government, it's going to actually make it difficult, or it's going to make a potential program maker think twice about going through all the hoops and getting all this flack, costing them more money and time in the process, and that's the dirty politics side of it. But I mean, you can get rid of that by just simply having a principle where non-party members are those that go on the board.
And there's too few politically controversial programs
this
on television. That's what we want, to get people thinking and arguing.
That's right.
We're not that controversial, are we?
Not yet. Keith, John Key, in defending McElroy's appointment yesterday, claimed that all he did was raise complaints from the public about the poverty documentary. Yet we know he complained before the documentary was even screened. Do we have a New Zealand On Air board member with psychic powers who can judge issues before he or anyone else has seen them? How can John Key's defence of his position stand?
Yes, it does seem very strange. And even if the case was true that he was responding to complaints from the public,
well, they hadn't seen it yet.
Yes, but his responsibility as a board member should be to tell any member of the public, get stuffed. You know, we are not going to intervene politically. This is free speech.
That's right, that's right.
So either way, John Key's wrong.
Should New Zealand On Air care more about journalistic credibility and an active questioning media than embarrassing the government when funding public broadcasting? Why should that come into it, the decision making?
I think John Key's made an awkward situation a lot worse by actually saying anything.
Yes, yes.
As far as New Zealand On Air is concerned, because this government has tended to work against the principles of public broadcasting, cutting off funding for TVNZ7, abolishing the charter, the broadcasting charter and so on, it means that more and more emphasis is going on New Zealand On Air to somehow be the saviour for decent, critical, whatever, programming, documentary making.
Yep.
So this debate around New Zealand On Air has even more urgency now than it did in the past, because they're really your last stop.
Yes.
If you want non-commercial programming made.
If you've got good public broadcasters like the ABC in Australia or SBS, they make a whole lot of their own programs independently with an independent structure, whereas the last bastion here is New Zealand On Air. If that goes sort of scary towards anything political, what have we got?
And the other point is that if New Zealand On Air accepts a program, then they have to persuade the commercially driven broadcasters to actually A, show it, and B, schedule it without slicing it up to pieces with ads in the middle. So there's not a direct process from New Zealand On Air onto the schedule. You've actually got to go through the logic of the ratings and the commercially driven nature of our television in order to get something that's able to be seen.
It is bizarre, isn't it, that TV3 are getting spanked for putting a political documentary in the week of the election, when that's the kind of behaviour you want to encourage from one of our broadcasters, surely.
Yeah, well, a lot of people didn't go out to vote. If more of those programs, people might have been more motivated to go out to vote.
When will David Farrar get appointed to the board of New Zealand On Air?
Oh, he doesn't have to, because he's doing National's job on the blogosphere.
Will we see David on the board of New Zealand On Air anytime soon?
I don't think so.
Oh, please God. Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3 tonight. The Auckland Council threw due process out the window this morning by sending the New Zealand police to rough up and arrest Occupy protesters, with police tactics like hiding their identities by using multiple badge numbers occurring yesterday. The occupation movement was always going to find it hard in the face of outright council power. Keith, is the occupation movement dead? Is it over?
I don't think so. Obviously, it's struggled a bit more in New Zealand than, say, in America, where they were confronting, all the huge bank bailouts and a larger scale, and that's where it all started. It's been stronger in parts of America and Europe, where there's already a sort of a big rebellion going on. But internationally, including New Zealand contribution, it has raised this issue of the 1%, the super rich, the growing inequality. And that's really infiltrated all the public consciousness, and even the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, all the super elite, the 1%, even now saying, oh, we've got to be a bit guilty now because there's all this pressure on us, and we've got to speak a bit different, even though we won't change anything.
If I can just be the devil's advocate, I don't think we can credit Occupy Auckland for the World Economic Forum.
Right. But why hasn't it worked in Auckland? Why hasn't it worked in New Zealand?
It was hardly a revolutionary moment.
No, it wasn't.
And when the police went in, it wasn't really a counter-revolutionary moment either. Look, the problem is, I support the idea of an Occupy Auckland in order to provide some resonance for the attack on investment banks that is occurring in London and New York and other major capitals of the world, major stock market centres of the world. So to actually go out in solidarity and occupy the building, fine. But it went on too long, and the focus got lost. And in any case, I wasn't convinced that the leaders of Occupy Auckland had any real economic knowledge of global capitalism or how capitalism has become financialised in the sense that taxpayers are bailing out investment banks and all the rest of it. I think if you were to interview anybody involved, their knowledge of those areas wouldn't be great.
A lot of the people that got involved were newly politicised people from the Facebooks and all the rest of it, and this was their first experience. When I went by in the early stages, there were a lot of public discussions, seminars. It performed its function, but it was always going to struggle in New Zealand context to go for a long time.
If you look at the New York one by comparison, they put out a counter news magazine called the Occupy Wall Street Journal, where they wrote alternative news to put what bankers are actually doing in stark empirical perspective. They had people like Lazov Zizek, Doug Henwood, you know, top luminaries of the intellectual left speaking to the occupiers, and there was a lot of theoretical reflection going on and what's happening around the planet. There was a real buzz, and that's what gave the movement its worldwide resonance. But I just don't think the locals here really quite got that.
But I don't think we need to feel inferior in
No,
New Zealand.
no,
A lot of what we do is a smaller scale than
You're
America
right.
or Britain.
But it is an interesting point, isn't it? That we feel that we weren't as connected to the fallout, and so the response wasn't as large. Yet when you look in actual comparison to our economy, the $1.7 billion bailed out to South Canterbury Finance is larger than the Lehman Brothers collapse to our economy than in America. And yet we don't have any sense of that in New Zealand, do we?
Bomber, that's a very good point. One of the key issues in the Occupy movement in New York is what you might call corporate welfare. American taxpayers are bailing out these ailing banks. We have corporate welfare in New Zealand.
Absolutely.
And you know, like
Tax
Rio
rates.
Tinto gets a very low rate of electricity
Don't they,
compared to ordinary
That means
residential
we've got
users.
a bit more work to do to get across some of those
And that
points.
comes back to public broadcasting, doesn't it?
And
Because we don't have that.
Oh, talking about
what is
corporate
going
welfare,
to happen organisationally, I think, you know, the reason why this has died out is it's sort of automatically things go on to a focus of either political parties like Nana the Greens or issue groups like Child Poverty Action Group, which will continue to raise these sorts of issues.
Wayne, was it too simplistic to think social media could really bring about change against an unjust corporate financial system? I mean, this was our first attempt at Facebook and social media leading some type of progressive change. Was the hope too high?
Social media by itself, just by itself, is never enough.
Right.
What social media can do is that if you've got a major protest action, say in different parts of the world, and those protest actions have some kind of solidarity or similarity, then what social media can do is capture the simultaneous nature of events. If there's a major Occupy movement in the City of London and another one in Wall Street and something similar happening in the Tokyo Stock Exchange, and there's coordinated actions, then social media is great for that. So I'd regard social media as pretty much a sufficient condition for cutting-edge activism today, but it's certainly not a sufficient condition.
How bad, Keith, do things need to get economically before movements like Occupy become actively supported by the wider public? How bad do things need to get?
I don't think they necessarily have to get a lot worse, but we see what we were talking about before with the battle around the waterfront and defending the union. It's you know, campaigning around issues like that can raise the consciousness, get new people involved, and that flows on to other issues. Who knows, the economy might go into a downward spin if there's a real crisis in Europe, milk price goes down and all the rest of it. And, you know, I think combined with, you know, what's been built up in terms of activism, you know, we can see something more significant.
Question to both of you. Wouldn't real leadership by Auckland Council be to send the bill to the government for the cost of occupation, seeing as it's the government who are creating the level of injustice that the protesting against? Shouldn't Auckland Council have shown a little bit more leadership on this issue?
Well, there's an even more important issue. That's the maritime unions dispute.
Right.
And it'd be good if the council and the Mayoralty and Super City Auckland show some leadership on that.
Yeah. Len Brown didn't show much leadership here, did he?
No, he's been pretty much out of the news for the last little while, and I think he has
Is he
to.
still alive, do you think?
He has to defend unions like the Maritime Union of New Zealand. They funded a campaign, not as a sort of, well, you've got to support us because we supported you, but I think there is an element of solidarity between organised groups of workers and what is supposedly more left workers representative in the form of the mayor.
And here's another possibility. If the Mayor of Auckland doesn't make these statements, and then they can't get out the vote in South Auckland for the next local body election and a right-wing candidate wins, then not only do the employer class get to privatise the services of the ports of Auckland, they can then have another go at the port itself.
Exactly. Let's wrap the show with last word. Keith, your last word this week is?
Well, I've been following this EU boycott against Iran and the American boycott, and
What's
it
going on
seems
there?
completely, well, I think it's got very little to do with the nuclear issue. I think it's a projection of power from the United States, because it's counterproductive if you're trying to help change in Iran, help the democratization. Everyone in Iran, including the democratic movement, thinks it's completely unjust that everyone's going to suffer because they're trying to choke off the oil exports from Iran and any banking system relation to that.
Yeah.
And even the Secretary of Defence in the United States, Leon Panetta, says, well, there's no evidence that Iran's producing a nuclear weapon, just that they are producing a bit of enriched uranium, which could potentially, years in the future, make a nuclear weapon. It's not really about the nuclear issue, as far as I can tell. And as I say, it's completely counterproductive. And New Zealand shouldn't support this boycott of Iran. And of course, we have a nuclear power in the Middle East called Israel. It's got 200, 300 nuclear weapons, and New Zealand doesn't say much about its nuclear weapons or what to do about them. It's all about maybe in the future some Iranian government might possibly produce a nuclear weapon.
Yeah. Thank you, Keith Wayne. Your final word this week.
Yes, well, we've been talking about economics and bankers, haven't we? This weekend, the World Economic Forum being held in Davos, and the leader of the forum, Klaus Schwab, under the heading of ethics and morality, which is apparently one of the agenda topics. For
Really?
Yes.
It's interesting for them.
He clearly realises that the Occupy movement has got a few arguments on their side, right? And he has said, quote, "We have sinned." I just want to point out that I haven't sinned. I don't think any of us have, but I'd like to know who the we actually is. What constituency is he talking for? And if he's talking for finance capital, which I hope he is, then I would like to see a full list of sins that they have committed so that they can appear before a tribunal at the Occupy Wall Street movement in New York City.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Wayne. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word. The mega upload arrests seem to have more to do with America trying to encroach their jurisdiction into cyberspace for the benefit of Hollywood's profit margin, while telling China that New Zealand's acquiescence shows Beijing that we are America's property. With the Pacific increasingly becoming the proxy that China and the US will wage their new Cold War through, New Zealand will need to work out how to play these two giants off against each other without getting crushed. As we get closer to signing the free trade deal with America, we need to appreciate the vast level of sovereignty John Key will be signing over to American international corporates. The food bill, the East Coast oil drilling, and the mega upload arrests are all glaring examples of America's insistence that we are going home with them after the dance and that America is not taking no for an answer. That sound you hear is David Lange turning in his grave at the lack of an independent foreign policy. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded news citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.